Millionaire didn't know he had a son until he met him at his ex-wife's grave. Before we get started, a little roll call. Tell us what town you're from, we're curious to know where we're being heard from. Now let's go. Sometimes the worst confessions are made when no one else can answer. Sebastian Rivera didn't like cemeteries. Why should he? His world was made up of skyscrapers, private jets and boardrooms where decisions were measured in millions. And here? It's meaningless. But he did come. The engraving on the black marble was neat, almost exquisite. Isabel Lucero. Beloved mother. Faithful friend. 1974 to 2019. Sebastian clenched his jaws. Not a word about love. Not a hint that she was someone else's woman. His woman. Or maybe he just wanted to think so. Strange to see you here. The voice came out of the blue. Young, low, tinged with cold contempt. Sebastian turned slowly and saw a boy, about 25, dark-haired, thin but sturdy. He stood by the grave with his hand in his pocket and looked at him with a slight sneer. Pardon me? Sebastian frowned. Isabel, the boy ran his palm over the stone, never said anything nice about you. Something tightened inside. Who are you? The young man slowly shifted his gaze to him. Javier, he said. Her son. Sebastian felt his breath catch. Sebastian felt something inside him snap. What? His voice betrayed him, sounding uncertain. He, Sebastian Rivera, the billionaire, the man who was used to controlling everything, was now standing in front of a stranger who had just turned his reality upside down. The guy, this same Javier, stared at him expectantly, as if enjoying the effect. There was no doubt in his gaze, only mockery and cold anger. Are you Isabel's son? Sebastian asked, as if hoping he'd heard him. Yes, Javier answered simply, nodding at the tombstone. See, it says, beloved mother. That's about me. Sebastian swallowed. That's impossible. He would have known. He would have been told. I didn't know, he finally squeezed out. Javier smirked. Really? There was pure, unbridled contempt in his voice. Of course you didn't. People like you only have children when it suits them. Wait, Sebastian took a step closer, but the boy pulled away. Don't touch me. He froze. I really didn't know, he repeated, his mouth drying as he said it. Well, now you do, Javier crossed his arms over his chest. So? You think it's time to make up for lost time? Sebastian opened his mouth, but couldn't find anything to say. Where were you when my mother was dying? Where were you when she was working 2 jobs to feed me? My insides are clenching. Javier, You know what the funny thing is? Javier clenched his fists. She never cursed you. She never complained. I didn't find out who you were until after she was dead. And now you come here like you care about her? Sebastian felt his world falling apart. Why didn't she tell me? He whispered. Javier grinned. Maybe because you betrayed her? Those words hit harder than he'd like to admit. Javier's phrase cut to the core. You betrayed her. Sebastian drew in air frantically, but his lungs felt tight. He didn't know how to respond. Say no? Justify himself? Ask what exactly he was accused of? But he seemed to already know the answer. Isabel's face flashed before his eyes, young, cheerful, with a sparkle in her eyes. The one to whom he had once sworn eternal love. I didn't betray her, Sebastian said quietly, but he couldn't even believe his own words. Javier squinted his eyes. No? Then let's remember how it was. His voice was full of sarcasm. Sebastian looked away. He didn't want to remember. But the past was already throwing a noose around him. 26 years ago. You didn't mean it, did you? Isabel stood before him, barefoot, in his shirt, her hair disheveled from sleep. She was still smiling, but there was a shadow of worry in her eyes. "I got the offer," Sebastian said, looking out the window. "It's what I've been dreaming of." "You've been dreaming?" she interjected. "What about us?" He closed his eyes. Of course she would say exactly that. "Isabel?" She stepped closer. "Are you really going to leave?" Sebastian took a deep breath. "This is my chance," he said, finally looking into her eyes. Isabel froze. The next moment her face became tense. "What about me?" He swallowed. "You'll be fine." She turned pale. "You're leaving me." "I'm giving us an opportunity," he tried to explain, but even to his ears he sounded like a pathetic coward. Isabel was silent. For a second. 2. And then she said quietly, "I'm pregnant." Sebastian froze. Time seemed to shrink into a point. "What?" "You heard." He swallowed convulsively, feeling something break inside. "Are you sure?" "Yes." His head was spinning. This wasn't part of his plans. He wasn't ready for this. "We'll be fine," Isabel said. "Just don't leave." But he could already feel the world falling apart. How he was getting cramped in this room. His heart pounding in his chest like a trapped bird. He didn't say anything. He just walked away. Sebastian squeezed his eyes shut, coming back to the present. He remembered. He remembered everything now. And he realized what he had done. Javier was waiting. "Well?" His voice was full of angry triumph. "Did you remember?" Javier stared at him intently, as if waiting. "Well, do you remember exactly how you gave us the opportunity?" Sebastian didn't answer. He felt a pain squeeze in his chest, but he couldn't allow himself to break down. Not here. Not in front of this guy who was looking at him with such hatred. "I didn't know," he finally squeezed out. Javier grinned. "You didn't know?" He shook his head. "You did know. You just made a choice." Sebastian wanted to object, but froze. Yes. He had made a choice. He didn't even have the words to say then. He just walked away. "What do you want from me?" His voice sounded hoarse. Javier exhaled slowly and looked at the tombstone. "Me?" he grinned. "That's okay. I did it on my own. Without you." He tucked his hands into his pockets and took a step back. "It's just that now you know," he said. "You know what your son looks like. And you know you don't deserve him." Sebastian felt everything inside clench into a cold lump. "Wait," he stepped forward, but Javier had already turned and strode away. He didn't even look in his direction again. And Sebastian realized, this guy really didn't expect anything from him. No money. No apology. No fatherly love. Just for him to know. To know and live with it. Javier walked away, disappearing among the tombstones, and Sebastian stood there, feeling the cold creeping under his expensive jacket. He raised his eyes to the sky, gray, low, impenetrable. "You don't deserve him." Those words embedded themselves in his brain like a stigma. Maybe Javier was right. Sebastian ran his hand over his face. Shit. He didn't even know how this guy lived. Where? What he did for a living. All he knew was that he was nothing to him. And that made him sick to his stomach. Sebastian returned to his office later than usual. It was empty inside, the receptionist had left, the staff had dispersed. He was alone, in a leather armchair, in front of the panoramic windows overlooking the glittering metropolis. Alone. All his life he'd thought money was freedom. The ability to choose. And he had chosen. But now, 30 years later, he realized that behind that choice was not wealth, but emptiness. There was a phone on the table. He could find Javier. Find out where he lived. Try to talk to him. But what could he say? I'm sorry. That's funny. I didn't know. That would be even worse. Sebastian picked up the whiskey glass and looked at the amber liquid. Javier didn't hate him. He despised him. And that was worse than any hatred. Sebastian sat in the darkness, watching the lights of the city, but there was no light inside him. Only a deafening, corrosive emptiness. He could forget. Just go on with his life as he had before. But that would be too easy. And inside him, in the farthest corner of his soul, something stirred that he couldn't put a name to. Conscience? Guilt? Or maybe a belated attempt to realize what he'd lost? The phone was nearby. Sebastian picked it up and opened a search. Javier Lucero. Lots of results. But nothing useful. He called his personal assistant. Find me everything on Javier Lucero. Certainly, senor. Is it urgent? It is. He hung up the phone and stared up at the night sky again. Who are you, Javier? What have you been through? And is there even the slightest chance you'll let me find out? A few hours later, a folder was brought to him. Javier Lucero. 25 years old. Graduated from technical college. Works as an auto mechanic. Lives in a small rented apartment in a poor neighborhood. No debt, but no prospects. Then suddenly, one line that hit him the hardest. Criminal record for fighting. Defended his mother. Sebastian clenched his jaw. He imagined Isabel raising the boy alone. How she'd worked, how she'd probably saved money on herself to feed him. How Javier clenched his fists when someone hurt her. And he realized, his son had grown up to be a man. Without him. The next day, Sebastian went to the auto shop where Javier worked. He didn't know what he was expecting. A warm welcome? A heart-to-heart talk? He opened the door, and the smell of machine oil and metal hit his nose. Can I help you? The guy behind the counter asked. I'm looking for Javier. Who's asking for him? Sebastian Rivera. Momentary pause. Then the guy nodded toward the garage. He's in there. Sebastian stepped inside. Javier was standing beside an old pickup truck, up to his elbows in oil. He wasn't even surprised to see Sebastian. Why did you come here? He asked dryly. I want to talk. 25 years too late. Give me 5 minutes. Javier grinned. You didn't hear me? I don't need a father. Especially not one who remembered me when he felt like it. I know I don't deserve that. All right, then. Since you know, you can go. Sebastian clenched his fists. Give me a chance. Javier wiped his hands with a rag without taking his eyes off him. One question, he said. If you had found out about me then, would you have stayed? The answer stuck in his throat. He didn't know. And that was the bitterest truth of all. Javier waited. He didn't look away, and there was no expectation or hope in his eyes. Only the cold calm of a man who already knew the answer but wanted to hear it out loud. Sebastian opened his mouth, but the words stuck in his throat. If I had known about you then, would I have stayed? Honestly? He didn't know. 26 years ago, he'd been a different man. Young, hungry for success, convinced that love could be put off and happiness could be bought with money. He dreamed of escaping poverty, of making a name for himself. And he wasn't ready for a son. But could he say that out loud? Sebastian sighed heavily. I don't know. Javier grinned and wiped his hands on a rag. Honestly. I didn't expect it from you. Sebastian looked up at him. I want to at least try. What? Fix the past? Javier snorted skeptically. Come on, tell me how you're going to do it. Bring back my childhood? Take me to soccer games when I was 10? Help my mom when she was sick? Where were you when I was fighting the local bastards for her? Sebastian clenched his fists. I can't change the past. Then why the hell are you here? There was silence. From far away came the hum of cars. Somewhere in the corner someone was arguing over a malfunctioning carburetor. The world lived, moved on. And they were standing in this damn garage, as if they were stuck in time. I can change the future, Sebastian finally said. Javier grinned. Why? Because I'm your father. No, his voice was cold. A father is someone who raises you, someone who is there for you. And you're just biology. Sebastian felt something squeeze inside. Javier wasn't looking at him anymore. Look, you said you wanted to give me a chance. And I'll be honest with you, you don't have one. I'm all grown up now. I don't need a daddy who suddenly remembers he has a son. Then what do you want? Nothing, he shrugged. I've learned not to want. Sebastian looked at him carefully. He saw before him a boy who had grown up too soon. Someone who wouldn't let himself hope, because hope always brought only disappointment. And for the first time in his life, he felt shame. But he couldn't leave. Not now. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he said slowly. And I'm not asking you to call me father. Javier stared at him silently. Just tell me, Sebastian swallowed. Is there anything I can do? Yes, Javier answered after a pause. You can leave. He turned away, picked up the tool again and leaned against the car's engine, signaling that the conversation was over. Sebastian stood for a couple more seconds. He wanted to say something else. But he realized, there was no point now. He had lost. But one thought lit up inside him, this was not the end. Sebastian left the workshop, but he was in no hurry to leave. He got into his car, but he didn't start the engine. Inside, everything was churning. You can leave. Javier isn't even angry. That was the problem. If he'd yelled, blamed, cursed, it would have been easier. But he just refused. Cut him out of his life like he was trash. And Sebastian knew he deserved it. But damn it, it was so hard to accept. He put his head down on the steering wheel, exhaled deeply. Could he really just leave it at that? But then why had he even gone to the cemetery that day? Why had fate pushed them together so harshly? So something isn't over yet. Sebastian picked up his phone and looked at Javier's file again. Criminal record for fighting. Defended his mother. He didn't even know what had happened then. A couple hours later, Sebastian was sitting in a small cafe, across from a woman he hadn't seen in over 20 years. I'm surprised you found me, she said, taking a sip of coffee. Carla Mendez. Isabel's former roommate. Someone who knew her when Javier was just a kid. Do you know what happened? He asked. She set the cup aside, stared at him for a long moment. Why do you want to know? Her voice was cold. I need to know. Carla grinned. You do. Where were you when Isabel was dying? When Javier was left alone? Sebastian gritted his teeth. I didn't know. That's your favorite phrase, isn't it? She sighed. Okay. Since you're here, listen. Javier was only 16 when he first came to the police. Isabel was dating a man then. Not a drunk or a scumbag, but not a saint. Then one day, in front of the boy, the bastard raised his hand to her. And Javier went crazy. Carla told it calmly, without drama. She saw the kid after that night. In the smashed lips, the bloody knuckles, in his bloody silence was the whole story. Was he on trial? Sebastian asked quietly. No, she shook her head. There was a criminal record, but no real jail time. Isabel went into tears then, into pleading. The judge took pity. Sebastian took a deep breath. And then? Carla shrugged her shoulders. Then? Isabel died a few years later. Javier was 20. Left alone. Next thing you know, he was pulling himself out of this life by his own hair. She looked intently at Sebastian. Now you tell me, what do you want? Why did you come here? Sebastian clenched his palms into fists. I want him to have a family. Carla grinned. You're too late, Rivera. He no longer has a need for a family. Then what am I supposed to do? Carla sighed. I don't know. But if you really want to redeem yourself, do it with actions, not words. She looked at him for a couple more seconds, then stood up, left the bill on the table and walked away. Sebastian was left sitting alone, staring at the cooling coffee. By deeds. He made his decision. It had been a hot day. The workshop smelled of oil, hot metal, and sweat. Javier rolled up his sleeves, wiping the evaporation from his forehead, when he saw a familiar silhouette. Sebastian. Again. Didn't you get it the first time? He asked without much emotion as he continued to work. I did. But there's one thing I still want to do. That's fine. Go ahead and do it. Sebastian looked around. Here? Why not? You're not shy about prying into my life, so what now? He saw the shadows in his father's eyes shift. Yes, he was deliberately pushing. Because he couldn't believe this sudden rush of paternal duty. Sebastian silently slipped his hand into his inside pocket and pulled out keys. Javier squinted skeptically. Is this some kind of payoff attempt? They're keys to an apartment. A nice apartment. Sebastian put them on the workbench next to the wrenches. In a better neighborhood. Javier grinned. Yeah. It's a classic. I'm sorry, son, here's an apartment for you. Is that how it works? No. It works like this, you take it because it's better for you. And you're a noble savior, Javier shook his head. I told you, I don't want anything. You said you learned not to want. But that's not the same thing. Javier wiped his hands irritably on a rag. You don't understand. And you don't even want to try to understand. There was a tense silence. You just want to make amends. Maybe I do. But you know it's not working. I know it won't fix the past. But I can at least try to fix the present. Javier clenched his jaw. He could feel everything boiling up inside. Damn it, why was he even listening to him? Why is this man still here? This apartment is not a handout. It's not a gift. It's an opportunity, Sebastian continued. You can do whatever you want with it. You can rent it out, you can sell it. But living in the hole you're in now isn't an option. Why do you care so much? Because I'm your father. Javier clenched his fists. No. A father is not someone who shows up 25 years later with the keys to the apartment. I agree. Javier blinked in surprise. I agree, Sebastian repeated. So I don't need you to take me in. Just, take the keys. The boy looked at them. A small piece of metal that could have made a difference. But was it worth it? Do what you want, Sebastian wiped his palms on his pants. But no, this won't be my last attempt. He turned and walked out. The keys were left lying on the workbench. Javier stared at them for a long time. Then he tossed them aside irritably. But for some reason his hands were shaking. Javier tried to work, but his thoughts kept returning to the keys, which were now lying in the corner of the workshop. As if cursed, they loomed before his eyes, giving him no rest. Why does he persist? What does he want? He was used to living without his father. Didn't need him. Wasn't looking for one. And certainly wasn't going to accept handouts. But the apartment. That night he couldn't sleep well again. His neighborhood was noisy as hell, drunks were yelling somewhere, someone was fighting, someone had turned up the music so loud that the walls were shaking. And that's when he caught himself thinking, what if? No. Don't fall for it. In the morning, he was irritable and angry. Walked out of the house, threw open the door, went to the workshop. Worked like a madman to drown out his thoughts. But a couple hours later, the door opened again. "You again?" he said tiredly, not even lifting his head. "No, not me this time." The voice was female. Javier turned around. A girl stood in front of him. About 28 years old. Expensive clothes, well-groomed hands, a confident look. "Who are you?" She bowed her head. "So he didn't even tell you about me?" "He's, Sebastian Rivera." Javier gloomed. "You're his wife?" She laughed. "No. Daughter." For a moment there was silence in the workshop. "Stop. What daughter?" "My mother is his first wife." She folded her arms across her chest. "You and I are brother and sister." Javier only opened his mouth, but he couldn't find the words. "Are you kidding?" "Not at all. My name is Celia." Javier ran his hand over his face. "Oh, for crying out loud." She smiled. "That's a good reaction. What do you want?" "To find out what kind of man my half-brother is." "He's nothing. Don't go looking for a brother here, sister." Celia frowned. "So you don't want to know him?" "I don't want to know him. But he wants to know you." Javier sighed. "Look, Celia, let's get straight to the point. Why are you here? Did Sebastian send you?" "No," she shook her head. "He doesn't even know I'm here." Javier narrowed his eyes. "Then why did you come?" Celia leaned closer. "Because you should know that our father has weaknesses." "So what? You think he just came into your life for no reason? Don't you? You think he suddenly decided to be good?" "No. He has motives." "Like what?" Celia smiled, but her eyes were wary. "I don't know yet. But I don't think it's just paternal duty." Javier stared at her in silence. "So," she continued, "you either accept his game or you tear it all to hell." Javier looked away. The keys were still lying on the workbench. Which would he choose? Javier was alone again. Celia had left as suddenly as she had appeared, leaving behind a vague unease. What the hell is going on? He'd lived 25 years without knowing his father existed. Now it turned out he also had a sister? A half-sister. Strange, smart, cold. Why did she come here? Javier took the keys, twirled them in his hands. This whole circus was starting to annoy him. He wasn't going to be part of someone else's drama. He decided he'd just give up and go on with his life. But in the evening, life threw him a new surprise. The doorbell rang. Javier opened the door. Sebastian stood on the doorstep. "What, you cannot calm down?" Javier asked tiredly. "I need to talk to you." "I think you've already said everything." "It's about Celia." Javier frowned. "She came to see me." "I know," Sebastian nodded. Sebastian sighed. "She's trying to turn you against me. Maybe because you deserve it? Maybe. But, believe me, she has her reasons. Come on, tell me what kind of Santa Barbara you've got going on." Sebastian crumpled the hat he was holding. "It's not as simple as it looks. I've already figured it out." Sebastian hesitated, as if deciding whether to go on. "She thinks I want to leave you my entire fortune." Javier blinked. "What?" "My entire estate, my business, my money. She's afraid you'll take her life away from her." "You're not going to do that, are you?" Javier asked skeptically. Sebastian looked at him slowly. "What if I do?" There was a heavy silence. Javier grinned briefly. "Don't joke like that, old man." "I'm not joking." He looked into his son's eyes. "I can't give you back the past. But I can change the future." Javier squinted his eyes. "Are you testing me?" "Maybe I am. If you think I want your money, I think you need an opportunity. An opportunity to do what? A better life. Javier was silent for a long time. Then he took the keys and put them back on the table. Let's start with the apartment. Sebastian nodded. Good choice. But there was something strange in his voice. Like he knew something Javier didn't. The apartment was empty. Javier stepped inside and looked around. Spacious rooms, expensive furniture, huge windows overlooking the city. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. He felt like an outsider here. Like it wasn't his place. But it belonged to him now. Or almost. In the last few days, his life had been turned upside down. A father he didn't know. A sister he didn't trust. Money he hadn't asked for. He walked over to the mirror in the hallway. Stared at himself. Do you even realize what you've gotten yourself into? At that moment, the phone rang. Javier flinched. Looked at the screen. Sebastian. He hesitated. Then he answered it. Are you in the apartment yet? My father asked. Yes. How was it? Expensive. Sebastian grinned. You get used to it. Why are you doing this? Javier finally asked. Sebastian fell silent. Because I want you to have a better life. Or because you want to make it up to me? Maybe both. Javier sighed. What's next? Then it's up to you. What if I decide I don't need all this? Then you just close the door and walk away. Just like that? Just like that? Yeah. There's a pause. But I'm not leaving, am I? Javier said quietly. Sebastian smiled. No, son. You won't. Javier ran his hand over his face. And Celia? She'll figure it out. You think she's just gonna let it go? I don't think so. Javier shook his head. Well, thanks for the warning. You're welcome. They were quiet for a moment. You realize we're still strangers, right? Sebastian smiled sadly. Yes. But maybe not forever. We'll see. He dropped the call. He stood for a while. Then he went out onto the balcony. The city had a life. He was part of it. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what was going to happen next. And that didn't scare him.